The satellite feed cut to static at 3:47 hours, leaving the Joint Operations Center in an eerie silence that no one wanted to acknowledge. Colonel Marcus Holbrook stared at the blank screen, his weathered hands gripping the edge of the tactical display table until his knuckles went white. Somewhere in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan, 8 Navy SEALs had vanished without a trace, their last transmission a garbled burst of coordinates and the word compromised. The briefing room buzzed with the kind of nervous energy that precedes impossible decisions. Intelligence suggested the team had been hunting a high-value target when they stumbled into something bigger, a network of caves that shouldn't exist on any map, defended by an enemy force that had somehow anticipated their every move. The rescue window was closing fast. Weather patterns showed a storm system moving in from the northwest, and once those mountain passes filled with snow, extraction would become a death sentence rather than a salvation. "Sir, we've got someone requesting permission to join the mission." Staff Sergeant Rodriguez appeared at Holbrook's shoulder, tablet in hand, his expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Holbrook glanced at the screen. The name made him pause. Captain Zara Ghost Naziri, the woman who'd somehow talked her way through flight school despite being told she was too small, too quiet, too different. The same pilot who'd spent the last 6 months relegated to transport runs and supply drops while her male counterparts got the combat assignments. Her service record was spotless, but spotless didn't mean proven, and this mission would demand the kind of precision that separated legends from casualties. "She's not even on the roster for high-risk operations," Holbrook muttered, though something in his voice suggested he was arguing with himself more than Rodriguez. "Actually, sir, she is now, as of yesterday, and sir," Rodriguez hesitated, then continued, "her last qualification scores were perfect, all of them." Through the reinforced glass windows of the briefing room, Holbrook could see the flight line where 2 MH-60 Black Hawks sat under the harsh glare of floodlights, their rotors already turning in preparation for a mission that might well be suicide. The mechanics moved around them with the practiced efficiency of men who understood that attention to detail meant the difference between heroes and body bags. In 6 hours, the sun would rise over mountains that had claimed more American lives than anyone cared to count, and somewhere in those peaks, 8 of the nation's finest warriors were either fighting for their lives or already beyond help. Captain Naziri stood at the edge of the tarmac, her helmet tucked under one arm, studying the aircraft with the kind of intensity that suggested she was seeing far more than metal and machinery. Her flight suit hung loose on her small frame, but there was nothing fragile about the way she carried herself. Each movement deliberate, economical, purposeful. The other pilots had started calling her Ghost not because she was invisible, but because she had an uncanny ability to appear exactly where she needed to be, exactly when she was needed most. The mission briefing had been brutal in its simplicity. 8 SEALs had been conducting a reconnaissance operation in the Kunar province when they discovered what intelligence suggested was a major Taliban supply depot hidden within a network of natural caves. Their last communication indicated they'd been compromised and were requesting immediate extraction from a landing zone that existed only in theory, a narrow ledge barely wide enough for a single helicopter, surrounded by peaks that reached toward 14,000 feet. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, the lead pilot for the primary extraction bird, had made his feelings about the mission crystal clear during the briefing. "It's a one-way ticket," he'd said, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that came from 5 years of combat operations. "That LZ is a postage stamp surrounded by rocks that'll turn a helicopter into confetti if you breathe wrong, and that's assuming we can even find the damn thing in this weather." The meteorological report painted a picture that made even veteran pilots uncomfortable. Winds gusting to 40 knots, cloud cover dropping to near zero visibility, and temperature conditions that would make engine performance unpredictable at best. Standard operating procedures called for scrubbing the mission until conditions improved, but standard operating procedures didn't account for 8 Green Berets who might not live to see improved conditions. Ghost had listened to the briefing without comment, her dark eyes moving between the topographical displays and the weather data with an intensity that made the other officers uncomfortable. When Morrison finished his assessment, she'd simply asked for the grid coordinates and the radio frequencies. No protests about the impossibility of the mission, no suggestions for alternative approaches, no questions about backup plans that everyone knew didn't exist. "You sure about this, Captain?" Holbrook had asked, studying her face for any sign of doubt or bravado. He'd seen too many good pilots killed by missions they thought they could handle, and something about Naziri's quiet confidence reminded him uncomfortably of his younger self. "Sir, those men are counting on us to bring them home," she'd replied, her voice carrying just enough of her father's Iranian accent to remind everyone in the room that she'd had to fight twice as hard for everything she'd earned. "I don't intend to let them down." Now, as she performed her pre-flight inspection with methodical precision, Ghost tried to push away the memory of her last conversation with her younger brother. He'd called from MIT, excited about some breakthrough in his engineering studies, talking about the future as if it were a guarantee rather than a hope. She'd listened to his enthusiasm and felt the familiar weight of responsibility that came with being the one who'd chosen to walk toward danger instead of away from it. The Black Hawks were magnificent machines, 30-foot rotors capable of carrying 11 combat-loaded troops through conditions that would ground lesser aircraft. But tonight, they would be flying at the edge of their operational envelope, loaded with enough fuel to reach the extraction point, but not enough for mistakes or second chances. The margins for error were so narrow they barely existed, and everyone on the flight line understood that this mission would either forge legends or create ghosts. Ghost completed her walk-around inspection and climbed into the cockpit of the lead aircraft, her movements smooth and confident despite the knot of tension in her stomach. The instrument panel glowed with dozens of indicators, each one representing a system that would need to function perfectly for the next 4 hours. She began her startup sequence, the familiar ritual of switches and checks that transformed a collection of metal and electronics into a weapon of war. The radio crackled to life with the voice of the tower controller, his words clipped and professional despite the early hour. "Viper flight, weather update shows conditions deteriorating faster than anticipated. Visibility dropping to less than half a mile in the target area, with strong turbulence reported above 8,000 feet. Morrison's voice came through the intercom, tinged with frustration. "This is getting worse by the minute, Ghost. We're flying blind into a shooting gallery." Ghost adjusted her night vision goggles and checked her GPS coordinates one final time. "Copy that, Viper 2. We have our waypoints and we have our mission. 8 men are depending on us to thread the needle." The phrase had become something of a motto for her during flight school, threading the needle, finding the path that others couldn't see, landing in spaces that seemed impossible. Her instructors had initially dismissed it as cockiness from a pilot who hadn't yet faced real combat. Now, with enemy fire and impossible weather waiting in the mountains ahead, Ghost wondered if confidence was just another word for the kind of faith that kept pilots airborne when logic suggested they should be anywhere else. The twin turboshaft engines spooled up to full power, their combined 4,400 horsepower creating a symphony of mechanical precision that could be felt as much as heard. The Black Hawk lifted off the tarmac with surprising grace for such a large aircraft, rising into the pre-dawn darkness like a predator ascending to hunt. Behind them, the lights of the forward operating base grew smaller and more distant, until they were just another constellation in a landscape that had swallowed countless warriors before them. Ghost keyed her radio and spoke the words that would commit them all to a course that offered no guarantees except the certainty of danger. "Viper flight is airborne and proceeding to waypoint Alpha. Time to bring our boys home." As the 2 Black Hawks disappeared into the darkness, climbing toward mountains that had witnessed 10,000 years of warfare. The silence they left behind carried the weight of prayers from those who understood that some missions define not just careers, but the very meaning of service itself. The flight toward the mountains passed in relative quiet, both aircraft maintaining radio silence except for essential navigation updates. Ghost kept her eyes on the instrument panel, watching the altitude climb steadily as they approached terrain that would challenge every aspect of her training. At 8,000 feet, the turbulence hit like an invisible fist, shaking the aircraft with enough violence to rattle equipment and test the limits of human equilibrium. Through her night vision goggles, the landscape below appeared as a surreal green wasteland of ridges and valleys, each feature potentially hiding enemies who had learned to use the terrain as both weapon and shield. Intelligence reports suggested that Taliban forces in this region had acquired sophisticated anti-aircraft weapons, including shoulder-fired missiles capable of turning a helicopter into a fireball before the crew even knew they were under attack. Viper 1, this is Overwatch. We're showing multiple heat signatures in your area of operations. Recommend extreme caution on approach to the LZ. The voice of the forward air controller carried the kind of tension that suggested the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Ghost acknowledged the transmission while mentally calculating wind speed, altitude density, and the dozen other variables that would determine whether her aircraft could maintain stable flight in the narrow confines of the mountain landing zone. The GPS coordinates led to a ledge barely 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, surrounded by rock faces that would create unpredictable wind patterns and eliminate any possibility of a normal approach. Morrison's voice crackled through the intercom, his concern evident despite professional restraint. Ghost, I'm reading wind shear that's off the charts. We're going to be flying through a blender up there. Copy, Viper 2. Stay tight on my wing and follow my lead. We're going to approach from the southwest. Use the terrain to mask our signature until the last possible moment. Ghost's voice carried the kind of calm that came from hours of simulation training and an absolute refusal to consider failure as an option. The approach to the landing zone required flying through a narrow canyon barely wide enough for the Black Hawk's rotor disc, with walls rising on both sides like the jaws of some enormous predator. Ghost descended slowly, fighting crosswinds that threatened to slam her aircraft into the rock faces with enough force to kill everyone aboard. Her hands moved across the controls with surgical precision, making dozens of tiny adjustments every second to maintain stable flight. At 500 feet above the target, the enemy opened fire. Muzzle flashes erupted from concealed positions throughout the canyon, creating a deadly light show that turned the night into a constellation of violence. Tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit windows like angry fireflies, and the distinctive crack of AK-47 automatic weapons echoed off the canyon walls with the sound of death looking for a target. Taking fire, taking fire. Morrison's voice carried the edge of a pilot who understood that their situation had just moved from dangerous to desperate. Multiple shooters, both sides of the canyon. Ghost pushed the Black Hawk into a steep descent, using gravity and momentum to reach the landing zone before the enemy could adjust their aim. The aircraft shuddered under the impact of several small arms rounds, but the armored fuselage held, and the engines continued their reassuring roar of mechanical reliability. The landing zone appeared through the darkness like a postage stamp balanced on the edge of forever, surrounded by terrain features that seemed designed by nature to destroy overconfident pilots. Ghost approached with the kind of precision that came from understanding that failure meant not just her own death, but the deaths of 8 SEALs who had already given everything they had to give. The skids touched down on the narrow ledge with barely inches to spare on either side, the rotor disc spinning just feet away from rock walls that would have turned the slightest miscalculation into catastrophe. Ghost held the aircraft in a stable hover, fighting winds that seemed determined to push them off the mountain and into the abyss below. Viper 1 on deck. Where are my passengers? She called over the radio, her voice carrying across the canyon with the authority of someone who had just performed what most pilots would consider impossible. From the shadows of the canyon emerged 8 figures moving with the tactical precision that marked them as America's elite warriors. They moved in pairs, covering each other's advance with the kind of coordination that came from years of training and absolute trust in their teammates. Even in the darkness, it was clear that several of them were wounded, their movements betraying pain that they refused to acknowledge. Team Leader Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reaper Davidson approached the aircraft with his weapon at the ready, his eyes constantly scanning for threats that might emerge from the darkness. His face, painted with camouflage that couldn't quite hide the exhaustion of 48 hours without sleep, showed the kind of relief that came from seeing salvation arrive in the form of a Black Hawk helicopter, and a pilot crazy enough to land it on the edge of the world. "Ma'am, we've got wounded and we need to move fast. They're repositioning for another assault, and this LZ is going to be hot in about 30 seconds. Davidson's voice carried the clipped urgency of a professional who understood that their window of opportunity was measured in heartbeats rather than minutes. Ghost held the aircraft steady against winds that threatened to lift them off the ledge before their passengers could board. "Get your men aboard, Chief. We're not leaving anyone behind." The SEALs moved with practiced efficiency, helping their wounded teammates into the cargo compartment while maintaining security against an enemy that had proven capable of sophisticated tactical thinking. 2 of the wounded were unconscious, their injuries severe enough to require immediate medical attention that could only be provided back at the forward operating base. As the last SEAL climbed aboard, enemy fire erupted from positions throughout the canyon with renewed intensity. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked through the darkness, their exhaust trails creating deadly fireworks that exploded against the rock walls with enough force to shower the aircraft with stone fragments. The sound was deafening, a symphony of violence that drowned out even the roar of the turboshaft engines. "We're loaded. Go, go, go," Davidson shouted over the noise, his voice barely audible above the cacophony of battle. Ghost pulled collective and pushed forward on the cyclic, lifting the overloaded aircraft off the narrow ledge with the kind of control that came from understanding exactly how much she could ask of her machine before it would refuse to respond. The Black Hawk rose through the canyon like a wounded bird, climbing toward altitude and safety, while enemy fire continued to light up the darkness below. A rocket-propelled grenade detonated close enough to the aircraft to shower the cockpit with fragments, spiderwebbing the armored glass and filling the air with the acrid smell of high explosives. Ghost felt the aircraft shudder under the impact, but maintained her climb, fighting controls that had suddenly become sluggish and unresponsive. "Viper 1, you're trailing smoke. System status report." Morrison's voice carried the concern of a wingman who could see damage that Ghost couldn't assess from the cockpit. Ghost ran through her instrument scan, looking for indications of system failures that could turn their rescue into a tragedy. Hydraulic pressure was dropping slowly but steadily, and the engine temperature gauges showed readings that were approaching the red line. They had enough power to reach friendly territory, but not enough margin for error to make mistakes. "Viper 2, I show hydraulic degradation and engine temperature climbing. We're going to need a straight shot home, no detours, no sightseeing." Ghost's voice carried the kind of professional calm that hid the fact that she was flying a damaged aircraft through hostile territory, with the lives of 8 elite warriors depending on her ability to keep them airborne. The flight back toward the forward operating base became a race between mechanical reliability and the limitations of damaged systems. Ghost nursed the aircraft through mountain passes that seemed determined to claim another helicopter, fighting controls that grew more sluggish with each passing mile. Behind her, the SEALs worked frantically to stabilize their wounded teammates, their medical training being put to the ultimate test in the cramped confines of a damaged aircraft. Chief Davidson made his way forward to the cockpit, his expression grim but determined. "Ma'am, I don't know how you managed to get us off that ledge, but you just saved 8 lives that were written off 24 hours ago." Ghost kept her eyes on the instruments, making continuous adjustments to maintain stable flight as systems continued to degrade. "Chief, we're not home yet. Your boys need medical attention, and this bird needs to stay in the air long enough to get them there." The lights of the forward operating base appeared through the darkness like a beacon of hope, their familiar glow representing safety and medical care for warriors who had given everything in service to their nation. Ghost began her approach with the kind of precision that came from knowing that a single mistake would waste the sacrifice of everyone who had fought to make this rescue possible. The damaged Black Hawk touched down on the medical evacuation pad, with a hard landing that reflected the reality of flying with compromised flight controls. Even before the rotors stopped turning, medical personnel were rushing toward the aircraft with stretchers and equipment that would give the wounded SEALs their best chance of returning to the lives they had risked in service to others. As Ghost shut down the engines and completed her post-flight inspection, she found herself surrounded by ground crew members who were already beginning the process of assessing battle damage and determining what would be required to return the aircraft to operational status. The Black Hawk had taken multiple hits, but it had completed its mission and brought everyone home alive. Colonel Holbrook approached the aircraft as Ghost climbed down from the cockpit, her flight suit soaked with perspiration, and her hands still trembling slightly from the adrenaline of combat flying. His expression showed the kind of respect that came from witnessing performance that exceeded every reasonable expectation. "Captain Naziri, that was some of the finest flying I've seen in 30 years of military service. Those men owe their lives to your skill and courage." Holbrook's voice carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what had been accomplished in the mountains that night. Ghost removed her helmet and ran her fingers through her hair, feeling the exhaustion that came from hours of maximum concentration under life-threatening conditions. "Sir, we got lucky. The aircraft performed, the weather held just long enough, and the enemy didn't have anything bigger than small arms and RPGs." "Lucky?" Davidson had approached during the conversation, his voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and amazement. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone thread a needle like that. You put that bird down on a ledge that most pilots wouldn't attempt in perfect weather, and you did it under fire in conditions that would ground commercial aviation." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of medical personnel who were preparing to transport the wounded SEALs to the base hospital. 2 of the men were in critical condition, their injuries severe enough to require surgery that would determine whether they would return to duty or be medically retired. The other 6 were ambulatory, but exhausted, their faces showing the kind of weariness that came from 48 hours of continuous combat operations. As the medical team worked with professional efficiency, Ghost found herself thinking about the phone call she would need to make to her brother. He would want to know about her mission, and she would tell him what she could without violating operational security. But she wouldn't tell him about the moment when enemy fire had come close enough to feel, or about the split-second decisions that had meant the difference between rescue and tragedy. The debriefing would come later, along with the paperwork and the analysis that would turn a night of terror and triumph into official reports and lessons learned. But for now, Ghost was content to watch the medical personnel load her passengers into ambulances that would take them to care and recovery. 8 men who had been written off as casualties were going home to families who would never fully understand the price that had been paid for their freedom. Morrison approached as the ambulances disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, his expression showing the kind of respect that had been notably absent during the mission briefing. "Ghost, I owe you an apology. I thought this mission was impossible, and I was ready to recommend that it be scrubbed. You proved me wrong in the most spectacular way possible." Ghost shrugged, already thinking about the maintenance requirements that would be needed to return her aircraft to operational status. "Jake, we all signed up to do impossible things. Tonight just happened to be my turn to prove it could be done." The eastern horizon was beginning to show the first hints of dawn, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson that transformed the landscape from a place of danger into something approaching beauty. Somewhere in those peaks, Taliban fighters were probably assessing their own losses and planning their next operation. The war would continue, with or without the 8 SEALs who had been extracted from what should have been their final battlefield. But for Ghost, the mission had accomplished something more significant than just the rescue of 8 warriors. It had proven that competence and courage were more important than the expectations of others, and that sometimes the most unlikely heroes were the ones who simply refused to accept that failure was inevitable. As she walked toward the debriefing room, Ghost could hear the distinctive sound of another Black Hawk starting up for a dawn patrol mission. The war continued, with new challenges and new opportunities for those who were willing to fly toward danger instead of away from it. She had proven herself in the most demanding circumstances possible, but she knew that tomorrow would bring new tests and new chances to demonstrate that excellence was not an accident, but a choice that had to be made again and again. The SEALs who had been extracted from the mountain ledge would recover from their injuries and return to duty, carrying with them the memory of a pilot who had appeared out of the darkness when they needed her most. Some would call it luck, others would call it divine intervention, but those who understood the true nature of military aviation would recognize it for what it really was: the perfect combination of skill, courage, and determination that transformed ordinary people into legends. Ghost's call sign had been earned through months of training exercises and transport missions, but tonight had given it new meaning. She had become a ghost in the most literal sense, appearing where others said it was impossible to go, completing missions that others said couldn't be done, and disappearing back into the darkness before the enemy could respond effectively. The debriefing room was filled with the kind of controlled energy that followed successful high-risk operations. Intelligence officers wanted to know everything about enemy positions and capabilities. Maintenance personnel needed details about aircraft performance under extreme conditions, and medical staff required information about the condition of the extracted personnel. Ghost answered each question with professional precision, but part of her mind was already focused on the next mission, the next challenge, the next opportunity to prove that limits existed primarily in the minds of those who accepted them. Colonel Holbrook remained after the others had left, his expression thoughtful as he reviewed the preliminary mission reports. "Captain, I'm recommending you for the Distinguished Flying Cross. What you accomplished tonight deserves recognition at the highest levels." Ghost felt a flush of pride, but also the weight of responsibility that came with such recognition. "Sir, I was just doing my job. Those men needed extraction, and we had the capability to provide it. Your job was to fly the mission, going above and beyond the call of duty, risking your life to save others, demonstrating exceptional skill under the most demanding conditions. That's what separates good soldiers from great ones." Holbrook's voice carried the authority of someone who had seen enough combat to recognize excellence when it appeared. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Chief Davidson, who had been released from the medical examination that all returning personnel underwent after combat operations. His face showed the exhaustion of someone who had been through an ordeal that would have broken lesser men, but his eyes held the clear satisfaction of a warrior who had completed his mission and brought his team home alive. "Captain, I wanted to thank you personally before I head to the hospital to check on my wounded. What you did tonight, there aren't words for it. My team and I will never forget that you were willing to risk everything to bring us home." Davidson's voice carried the kind of emotion that professional soldiers rarely allowed themselves to show. Ghost shook his hand, feeling the calluses that marked him as someone who had spent years handling weapons and equipment in the service of his country. "Chief, "It was an honor to serve with you and your team. I hope your wounded recover quickly and completely." As Davidson left to check on his men, Ghost found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time since the mission briefing. The adrenaline was finally beginning to fade, replaced by the kind of exhaustion that came from hours of maximum stress and concentration. But underneath the fatigue was a sense of satisfaction that came from knowing she had lived up to the standards that had been set by those who came before her. Her father would have been proud, she thought. He had come to America with nothing but determination and a willingness to work harder than anyone around him. He had built a successful business and raised children who understood that excellence was not a destination, but a journey that required constant effort and attention to detail. Tonight, she had honored his memory and the values he had instilled in her. The phone call to her brother could wait until after she had slept and processed the events of the night. He would be excited to hear about her mission, but he would also worry about the dangers she faced on a regular basis. She would tell him enough to satisfy his curiosity, but not enough to cause him unnecessary concern. Some burdens were best carried alone. As Ghost made her way to her quarters, she passed the flight line where maintenance crews were already beginning work on her damaged Black Hawk. The aircraft that had carried her through the mission would be repaired and returned to service, ready for the next pilot who would push it to its limits in service to the mission. She paused to watch the technicians assess the battle damage, their professional expertise ensuring that the helicopter would be ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The sun was fully above the horizon now, painting the forward operating base in the harsh light of another day, in a war that had been going on for longer than most people cared to remember. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of artillery fire as ground forces continued operations against an enemy that seemed to melt away and reappear at will. The war would continue, with or without her participation, but tonight had proven that individual actions could still make a difference in the lives of those who served. Ghost's quarters were spartanly furnished but comfortable, reflecting the temporary nature of military life and the need to be ready to move at a moment's notice. She had lived in dozens of similar rooms over the years, each one providing shelter and security, but never becoming home in any meaningful sense. Home was wherever her unit was stationed, wherever her skills were needed, wherever she could make a contribution to the mission and the welfare of her fellow service members. She lay down on the narrow bed and closed her eyes, but sleep didn't come immediately. Her mind kept replaying the events of the night, analyzing each decision and considering what she might have done differently. The approach to the landing zone, the reaction to enemy fire, the management of aircraft systems under stress. Each aspect of the mission would be reviewed and studied until it became part of the institutional knowledge that would help future pilots succeed in similar circumstances. Eventually, exhaustion overcame analysis, and Ghost drifted into the kind of deep sleep that came after missions that pushed human capabilities to their absolute limits. Her dreams were filled with the sound of rotor blades and the feel of flight controls responding to her touch, carrying her through landscapes that existed somewhere between memory and imagination. When she woke, it was to the sound of her call sign being announced over the base public address system. "Captain Naziri, report to the command post immediately. Captain Naziri to the command post." Ghost checked her watch and realized she had slept for nearly 12 hours, longer than she had intended, but probably exactly what her body needed after the stress of the previous night. She dressed quickly and made her way to the command post, wondering what new challenge or opportunity awaited her attention. The command post was buzzing with the kind of controlled activity that suggested something significant was happening. Officers moved between workstations with purpose, their conversations conducted in the low tones that indicated sensitive information was being discussed. Ghost reported to the duty officer, who directed her to Colonel Holbrook's office with instructions to proceed immediately. Holbrook looked up from a stack of reports as she entered, his expression showing the kind of satisfaction that came from receiving good news. "Captain, I've just gotten off the phone with Division. The 8 SEALs you extracted last night are all going to make full recoveries. The 2 who were most seriously wounded are stable and responding well to treatment. Ghost felt a wave of relief wash over her. The success of a rescue mission was measured not just by the extraction itself, but by the long-term outcome for those who had been saved. Knowing that all 8 men would return to their families, and their careers made every risk that had been taken worthwhile. That's excellent news, sir. Those men showed incredible courage and professionalism under the most difficult circumstances. Ghost's voice carried genuine respect for the SEALs who had endured 48 hours of combat before their rescue. There's more, Holbrook continued. Your actions last night have attracted attention at the highest levels. General Morrison, yes, that Morrison, the CENTCOM commander, wants to meet with you personally when his schedule permits. It seems your reputation is beginning to precede you. The idea of meeting with a 4-star general was both exciting and intimidating, but Ghost understood that such recognition came with increased expectations and responsibilities. Excellence was its own burden, requiring constant effort to maintain the standards that others now expected from her. Sir, I'm honored by the recognition, but I hope it doesn't mean I'll be spending more time in briefing rooms and less time in cockpits. Flying is what I do best, and it's where I can make the greatest contribution to the mission. Holbrook smiled, understanding the perspective of a pilot who measured success in terms of missions completed rather than medals earned. Don't worry, Captain. The general is a pilot himself, and he understands that the best place for talented aviators is in the cockpit. But he also recognizes that exceptional performance deserves exceptional opportunities. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Chief Davidson, who had returned from the hospital with updates on his team members. His appearance was dramatically improved from the previous night, the exhaustion replaced by the kind of energy that came from knowing his men were going to survive and recover. Captain, I wanted to give you a personal update on my team. The doc says everyone is going to make a full recovery, including the 2 who were touch and go last night. Martinez and Johnson are already asking when they can return to duty. Davidson's voice carried the pride of a leader whose men had proven themselves under the most demanding circumstances. That's the best news I could have received, Chief. Your team showed incredible resilience and courage. I'm honored to have been part of bringing them home. Ghost's response reflected genuine respect for warriors who had demonstrated the highest standards of military professionalism. As Davidson prepared to leave, he paused at the door and turned back toward Ghost. Ma'am, I don't know if anyone has told you this, but what you did last night, landing on that ledge under fire, extracting 8 men from what should have been an impossible situation, that's the kind of thing that becomes legend in the special operations community. You're going to find that doors open for you that most pilots never even knew existed. After Davidson left, Ghost found herself contemplating the implications of his words. She had joined the military to serve her country and to challenge herself in ways that civilian life couldn't provide. Recognition and advancement were welcome, but they were not the primary motivations that drove her to excel. The satisfaction came from knowing that her skills had made a difference in the lives of others, that her willingness to accept risk had resulted in outcomes that justified the faith placed in her by those who depended on her capabilities. Colonel Holbrook seemed to understand her thoughts without her expressing them verbally. Captain, I've seen a lot of good pilots over the years, and I've learned to recognize the ones who have the potential to become truly exceptional. You have that potential, but more importantly, you have the character to handle the responsibilities that come with exceptional capability. Ghost nodded, understanding that the colonel was offering both recognition and guidance. Sir, I appreciate the confidence you've shown in me. I hope to continue proving myself worthy of the opportunities I've been given. You already have, Captain. Last night proved that beyond any reasonable doubt. Now the question is what you want to do with that proof. There are staff positions available that would advance your career, training commands that would benefit from your experience, and operational units that would welcome your capabilities. The choice is yours. The decision, Ghost realized, would define not just her immediate future but the entire trajectory of her military career. Staff positions offered advancement and influence, but would take her away from the cockpit and the direct service that had drawn her to military aviation. Training commands would allow her to share her knowledge with the next generation of pilots, but might limit her opportunities for continued operational experience. Operational units would provide the continued challenge and excitement of combat flying, but might also limit her advancement opportunities. Sir, I need some time to consider the options. This is a decision that will affect not just my career, but my ability to contribute to the mission in the most effective way possible. Take all the time you need, Captain, but remember that exceptional performers don't always get to choose the timing of their opportunities. When the call comes, you need to be ready to answer. Holbrook's words carried the weight of experience and the understanding that military careers were often shaped by moments of decision that couldn't be delayed or avoided. As Ghost left the command post, she found herself thinking about the path that had brought her to this point. Flight school had been a challenge that she had met through determination and endless hours of study and practice. Her early assignments had been routine, but she had approached each mission with the same intensity and attention to detail that she had brought to the rescue operation. Excellence, she had learned, was not something that could be turned on and off depending on the circumstances. The flight line was busy with the constant activity of a forward operating base at war. Helicopters were landing and taking off on missions that ranged from routine supply runs to combat operations that would test the limits of aircraft and crew capabilities. Ghost watched the activity with the eye of a professional who understood the complexities and dangers involved in each sortie. Her damaged Black Hawk was still in the maintenance hangar, surrounded by technicians who were working to repair the battle damage from the previous night's mission. Ghost made her way to the hangar, curious to see the extent of the repairs that would be required to return the aircraft to operational status. The maintenance chief, Master Sergeant Williams, looked up from his inspection as she approached. "Captain, your bird took quite a beating last night, but she's built tough. We'll have her back in service within 48 hours, good as new and ready for whatever you want to throw at her next." Ghost examined the battle damage, noting the impact points where enemy rounds had struck the fuselage, and the scarring where rocket fragments had peppered the aircraft. Each mark told a story of violence survived and missions completed despite odds that should have been insurmountable. "Sergeant, this aircraft performed flawlessly under conditions that would have challenged any helicopter in the inventory. Whatever you and your team did to maintain her, it made the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure." Williams nodded, understanding the compliment and the responsibility it implied. "Ma'am, we take care of these birds like they were our own children, because we know that pilot and crew lives depend on every bolt, every system, every